The origin of the so-called curse of Ham begins in Genesis 9 verses 20 to 27. After the great flood, Noah, a man chosen by God, plants a vineyard, drinks too much wine and falls asleep naked in his tent. His son Ham sees his father's nakedness and tells his brothers Shem and Japheth. The two brothers respectfully cover their father without looking. When Noah wakes up and learns what happened, he doesn't curse Ham. Instead, he curses Ham's son Canaan. Cursed be Canaan. The lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers. That's it. One verse. And yet this line has been distorted, expanded, and weaponized into a doctrine of racial inferiority that would shape global systems of slavery and colonialism. In its original context, the curse is directed specifically at Canaan, not Ham, and there is no mention of race, skin color, or Africa. Yet over time, theological manipulation turned this brief passage into a racial indictment of all African peoples. To understand this manipulation, we must examine how ancient genealogies, allegories, and symbols were later reframed to serve colonial interests. This was not scripture at work, it was empire. Genesis 10, known as the Table of Nations, lists Ham as the father of Cush, Nubia/Ethiopia, Mizraim, Egypt, Put, Libya or parts of North Africa, and Canaan. Because of these names, Ham became associated with the African continent. But this genealogy was about tribes and nations, not about race as we understand it today. In the early centuries, neither Jewish nor Christian scholars interpreted these passages racially. The transformation came with Islamic and European commentators centuries later. Writers like Al-Tabari described Ham's descendants as dark-skinned, implying divine punishment. European clerics and philosophers then amplified this distortion, fusing skin color with servitude. As the transatlantic slave trade began, Ham became the symbolic ancestor of all black people, and his story the so-called divine justification for their subjugation. By the 15th century, European powers needed a moral framework to justify the mass enslavement of Africans. They turned to the Bible, and the curse of Ham became their theological weapon. The Portuguese, Spanish, and later British and Dutch empires cited this myth to paint slavery not as sin, but as divine order. Missionaries and merchants alike embraced this ideology. Even Enlightenment thinkers who valued liberty and equality clung to this myth. John Locke, hailed as a founding father of liberal democracy, defended slavery using biblical texts. His political writings helped lay the groundwork for systems of oppression rooted in so-called divine logic. Over 12 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic under the shadow of this lie. It was quoted in sermons, etched in policy, and used to baptize bondage. As European empires expanded, the myth evolved. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the curse of Ham merged with emerging racial science. Thinkers like Carl Linnaeus and Blumenbach classified humans into racial hierarchies. Africans, sons of Ham, were placed at the bottom. The curse provided moral and religious validation. This pseudoscience infiltrated every level of society: education, religion, law, and governance. It justified colonization, segregation, apartheid, and Jim Crow. The myth was no longer just about theology, it had become a political tool and scientific fact. Even abolitionists sometimes failed to dismantle the core myth, treating Africans as spiritually broken people needing salvation through Western norms. Thus, the curse mutated, embedding itself into the global imagination. To be told you are cursed by God does not simply imprison your body, it imprisons your soul. The myth birthed a culture of self-hate and shame. It introduced colorism within black communities. It distorted perceptions of beauty, intelligence, and worth. Skin bleaching, linguistic shame, and cultural erasure are just modern symptoms of this ancient lie. Generations of African children grew up believing they were spiritually inferior, cursed from birth, and only valuable if they could assimilate. This is the psychological damage of Ham's curse. Yet even in the shadows, resistance never died. African resilience, expressed in stories, songs, rituals, and rebellions, kept truth alive. The tide is turning. Across the continent and throughout the diaspora, A wave of African theologians, historians, and spiritual leaders are dismantling the myth of the curse of Ham, not just academically but spiritually. They are not merely reacting to the lie. They are rewriting the narrative entirely. From Nigeria to South Africa, from Ethiopia to the Caribbean, scholars have begun asking critical questions. What if our understanding of Scripture has always been filtered through the lens of empire? What if the Bible itself has been misread, misquoted, and mistranslated to serve power instead of truth? One of the most powerful voices in this movement was Dr. John Mbiti, the Kenyan theologian and philosopher who revolutionized the study of African religion. He argued that African spirituality was not primitive or pagan, but rich, complex, and deeply monotheistic long before Christianity arrived. He wrote, "Africans are notoriously religious." But he did not mean this as a stereotype. He meant that Africans live their faith, not just in rituals but in values, ethics, and the sacredness of life. Mbiti and others challenged the Western Christian establishment by highlighting that African Christianity predates European colonization. Christianity arrived in Ethiopia in the 4th century, not by force but through dialogue and diplomacy. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church remains one of the oldest Christian communities in the world. Its theology has always affirmed the dignity of African people. Other thinkers like James Cone, the father of Black liberation theology, emphasized that Christianity should be a force of liberation, not oppression. He argued that any reading of the Bible that supports racism is a misreading. God, he said, is on the side of the oppressed. In South Africa, theologians like Alan Bozak and Desmond Tutu used scripture to fight apartheid, exposing how biblical text had been twisted to support white supremacy. They taught that the gospel is not neutral, it takes sides with justice. Today, young theologians, pastors, and historians are continuing this work. They are using African languages to interpret scripture, reviving suppressed oral histories, and creating platforms where African spiritual perspectives can flourish. They are asking, what does it mean to read the Bible as an African? What truths have we lost by reading it through colonial eyes? The answers are empowering. They point to a faith tradition that is older than colonization, stronger than slavery, and deeper than any curse. They reclaim a theology that affirms Black identity, African wisdom, and spiritual resistance. They do not deny the pain of history, but they refuse to let that pain define the future. This is more than scholarship. It is an act of spiritual warfare, because to reclaim the truth is to break the curse. The story of Ham's curse was used to build empires. But today we are building something different, a legacy rooted in truth, resilience, and pride. Across the African continent and throughout the global diaspora, a cultural and spiritual awakening is underway. Africans are reconnecting with their roots, rediscovering their histories, and reclaiming their voices. Activists, artists, educators, and spiritual leaders are confronting the myths that once defined them. From Pan-African movements to Black Lives Matter protests, the cry for justice is not just political, it's ancestral. It echoes with the voices of the enslaved and the colonized, now speaking through a new generation. Education is at the heart of this revolution. In schools, online platforms, and community spaces, more people are learning about the real history of Africa, its kingdoms, its scholars, its prophets. They're learning that Timbuktu was a center of learning long before Oxford, that Ethiopia resisted colonization, that the Congo kings corresponded with the Vatican centuries ago. Spiritual reclamation is happening too. African spiritual systems, once demonized, are being revived, not to replace other religions but to reconnect with ancient wisdom. From Yoruba to Vodun, from Kemetism to Rastafarianism, people are embracing practices that affirm their identity, dignity, and divine connection. And perhaps most importantly, we are seeing a shift in how Blackness is perceived, by the world and by Black people themselves. From Afrofuturism in film to Afrobeat in music, from Nollywood to the Harlem Renaissance revival, African creativity is commanding global attention. not as exotic but as essential. This new legacy is not just about confronting oppression. It's about creating something greater than what was lost. It's about telling our own stories. It's about raising children who do not see themselves as cursed, but as chosen. It's about building a future where African identity is not a wound to be healed but a strength to be celebrated. The curse was never real, but the liberation is. The curse of Ham was never a curse. It was a lie, a weapon, a tool of domination. But its power was never in its truth. It was in our belief. Now that belief is crumbling. The Bible does not condemn Africans. History does not begin with colonization. An identity is not something to be stolen, it is something to be reclaimed. May this truth set us free. The curse is broken. And from the ashes of the myth, a new story begins. A story of dignity. A story of resilience. A story of Africa.